I'd like to kick off by actually acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of this great country of ours, Australia, as well as those in Africa where I do a lot of work. And this morning I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to give you an overview of carbon trading with an agricultural focus. Okay, so some background. We Australians have agreed at Paris. Our emissions reduction target is to hit, we produced 612 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2005. And we're hoping to reduce that by 26 to 28% to 411 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. To give you an idea what a carbon dioxide equivalent is, carbon dioxide itself has a global warming potential of 1. Methane is 25 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So releasing 1 ton of methane into the atmosphere is equivalent to releasing 25 tons of carbon dioxide. And similarly, releasing nitrous oxide into the environment, into the atmosphere, is equivalent to releasing 298 tons of carbon dioxide. If I invert those data, you've got 1,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, or 1 ton, is the global unit that we use for carbon trading. And if we invert those data, we've got 40 kgs of methane is equivalent to 1,000 kgs of carbon dioxide, and 3.4 kgs of nitrous oxide is equivalent to 1 ton, 1,000 kgs of carbon dioxide. And in Australia, we trade that as 1 carbon credit unit, or ACU. The government abolished the carbon tax in 2014 and replaced it with the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is also called the ERF. And this is a federal fund of our taxpayers' money to meet the Paris targets. It's administered by the Clean Energy Regulator, CER, and initially they seeded that with 2.55 billion Australian dollars. Out of that, 788 projects have been developed, and that's across the board. So 788 projects have been registered, not only in agriculture, right across the board. And the government buys these ACUs on auction, and so far they've had 9 auctions to date. The average price has been $12.02. And that's actually bought us 192 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, abatement contracted, and actually delivered 45 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's what's been delivered. 237 million remains in the fund, and in February this year they topped it up with $2 billion. The CER, the Clean Energy Regulator, has what they call eligible activities. These are methodologies that they've devised so that you can actually get into a carbon project. There are about 40 of these across all industries, so it includes transport and electricity, etc. But I'm only going to talk about 3 of these today, which are related to agriculture. The first one is human-induced regeneration of a permanent even-aged natural forest. The second one is Savannah Burning, emission avoidance methodology. And the one that I guess you guys are most interested in, which is the beef herd management method. Kicking off with the human-induced regeneration of a permanent aged forest. This allows vegetation to regenerate by changing factors preventing regeneration. So remove livestock, remove feral animals, remove borehole pumps so there's no water for these animals, so they have to leave the land, or put in fences to keep them out. And you measure the amount of biomass before you start the project, and you measure it regularly during the project, and from that you work out how many ACUs you earn as that bush recovers. Probably equivalent to what Steve's going to be talking about with bush thickening. Mostly in isolated areas. There's been quite a lot of criticism of this because it's basically un-agriculture. It's basically taking agriculture out of those lands. And the most vulnerable people, i.e. the young and younger people in those industries, are actually leaving the industry because basically these farms are closing down. So let me get straight on to Savannah Burning, which is a bit more interesting. So this is a strategic use of cool early dry season fires. And by definition, these are the 1st of January to the 31st of July each year. And you use those fires to burn fire breaks to reduce fuel. And those fires that you burn at that period are considered positive for your project. Plus any areas that are not burnt at all during the year are positives. Hot, late dry season fires, by definition from the 1st of August to the 31st of December, are considered wildfires and go negative against your project. SAVBAT is a program devised by the University of Darwin, and that's actually used to calculate the abatement. And what that is, they use the fire scar maps from the North Australian Fire Information Services, NAFI, and again there's a link there, and data supplied by you as the project. So what I've actually done is I've actually put together a fictitious project. And the first thing that happens is that these projects have to be north of the 600 millimeter rainfall line, the 600 millimeter ISO height. And that area there gets 600 millimeters to 1,000 millimeters. Above 1,000 millimeters, you get higher yields of ACCUs. So SAVBAT actually divides it into two areas. Note one important thing here. The only Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Queensland that actually qualify for this. Anyone south of the 600 millimeter ISO height doesn't qualify for these programs. So I've actually put together a fictitious site there. Jody, that'd be sort of south of Catherine, hey, maybe? Yeah, something like that. And I've particularly chosen it because it actually straddles the two areas. So what SAVBAT does is, firstly, it adds up, to get to the top, I've actually looked at 2018, last year as being the project first year. The SAVBAT determines that 2003 to 2017 are the baseline years. And what SAVBAT does is it takes data from a fictitious vegetation map that I put together, and it calculates the emissions from burns that actually happened during those periods. It takes 10 years data for the high rainfall area and 15 years data from the lower rainfall area, and averages them, and then adds those two figures up to give us that figure there. And that project baseline remains the baseline for the lifetime of that project, whether it lasts for 25 years or 100 years, whatever you've chosen to do. What the program also does is it adds up your emissions from that particular, from 2018. It subtracts that from that and gives us that figure there, that one there, and effectively your ACCUs, because that there is 14,230 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So the number of ACCUs you've actually generated from that project is 14,230. So what does it cost to run a project like this? And these again are fictitious figures, but more or less accurate. So firstly, you have to have this map of your vegetation. They have to bring in helicopters to do that. It's going to cost you about 40 grand to do that, up to 50 grand. Registration, if you get someone else to do that for you, plus getting the contract with the government and bidding on the auction, is going to cost you about $25,000 once-off cost. Risk mitigation, now if you go back and look at these data here, you'll see how much they fluctuate. Unless you actually do something about to actively prevent fires, you're going to end up with a major problem. You're going to have a shortage of ACCUs. So it's really a good idea to get some sort of risk mitigation. In other words, sort of insurance against you not achieving the ACCUs, because the government will not actually negotiate. If you don't produce the ACCUs, you're going to have to find them somewhere else. The government will audit you at least twice, probably 4 times, and that's going to cost about 15 grand. Project management, I've actually put in 10% of the earnings from that project, so you can get an idea of what this, finally multiplied out, is going to come to. Putting in fire breaks, burning, etc., is going to cost you about 60 grand. And the average ACCU price is $12.02, and you've earned 14,230 ACCUs. So doing some sums, you amortize some of those things against 25 years, and some of them are once a year cost, and they sort of line up. So that gives you an idea of what it's going to cost you to run a project, about $96,000. And in this particular example, you're making $171,000. You're making 74 grand. So it actually looks pretty good. But bear in mind, it's not always good. Sometimes you can come horribly unstuck if there's lots of late season wildfires, which you can't control. So that's a positive outcome. To actually run a project, you've got to have meet certain criteria. The first thing, you've got to be an Australian person or entity, which kind of makes sense. You've got to have the legal right to run the project, which kind of makes sense. You've got to own the land, or you've got to own the title, the lease, or you've got to own the cattle. And those figures, by the way, with the exception of the vegetation map, are also sort of common for the beef herd management as well when I start talking about that. And then you have to get permission from eligible interest holders on area-based projects. In other words, the Savanna and the HR that I spoke of earlier, you've got to get permission from other people. So working from the bottom of that list up, if there's a mortgage, you've got to get the bank to agree to it. If it's the state and territory government, for the leasehold, you've got to get them to actually approve. And essentially, Queensland, Northern Territory give permission relatively easily. The other interesting thing is that you've got to get native title holders. If there's a determination over your land, you've got to get the traditional owners to give you permission to run that project. Pastoral companies in these regions here aren't able to get the traditional owners to give permission, and so a lot of projects have actually been stalled because of that. But there are a number of Aboriginal corporations up in Cape York and in the Territory Arnhem Land, which are actually doing incredibly well out of their own Savannah burning projects. And as a result of those projects, we're getting a lot of flow of, well, they're creating a lot of ACCUs, but they're also getting a lot of funds back to those projects, which is great. But on the downside, we're not actually attracting the jobs. The jobs are still staying. They've actually migrated a lot from Brisbane, have gone down to New South Wales. And really, really bizarrely, some of these projects are actually managed from overseas. And the jobs that the guys are getting up in those areas from the Aboriginal communities are things like burning fire breaks and burning fuel. And it would be great if we could actually somehow get some jobs going back to those areas. But I'll talk to that a bit later. Okay, getting into the thing that most of you are probably interested in, which is the beef herd methodology. We actually produced 611 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2005. Our livestock produced 61 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. In other words, 10% of all the emissions from Australia, 10% of our emissions come from our livestock. And that's 75% from cattle. 75% of the cattle in this country are in Queensland, more or less. So that means that 5% of all the emissions in Australia are coming from the cattle industry in Queensland. And that's a bit of a shock, but on the other hand, it also means that if we do something about it, we can actually make a contribution to reducing Australia's emissions. We can actually make a serious contribution to reducing those emissions. Where do our greenhouse gases come from in the industry? Well, methane and nitrous oxide. So methane from the digestive process, nitrous oxide from dung and urine. This just gives you a bit of an example of the sort of sums that are going to come out of a project like this. Each animal produces about 72 kgs or 0.072 tons of methane per year. You multiply it by the global warming potential there by 25, that gets us to carbon dioxide equivalents of 1.8 tons per year. Carbon dioxide reduction per head is about 0.2 tons if you're looking at about 10 or 12 or 13%, something like that. And that comes out to 0.2 ACCUs per head per year. So that's just a little bit of a visual to give you an idea. If, for example, you've actually got $10, so we can actually do the sums, $10 per ACCU, then basically you're getting about $2 per animal per year out of these projects, to give you a feel of what you're going to earn from it. And when you take those figures I spoke about earlier, 15 grand for audits and 25 grand to run projects, your break even is going to be roughly around about here. But don't despair. If you don't have 30 or 40,000 head of cattle, you can still run these projects, because the actual methodology itself allows entities that are not connected commercially to aggregate their projects. So we can get a cattle herd in the Pilbara, with one in Alice Springs, with one in Katherine, with Cloncurry, Huon and Cape Grim in Tasmania, all to get together and actually share the costs of these projects. And the methodology itself actually allows you to very, very clearly distinguish between who's actually making money and who's not. So it's easy to actually decide who's actually doing well and who's not. And that actually also means that your club can start discussing what some guy's doing better than you are and start actually improving your herds. So this just gives you a hint that there's actually something that's really beneficial from doing these projects. Just as a little bit of an aside, but something that I've got a serious beef about, is this slide here. Thanks, Jody. Yeah, okay. So I'm comparing Brazil to us. And Brazil has 8 times the number of cattle we've got. They produce 4 times the amount of beef. Cool. They produce 5 times the emissions, which means there's something wrong. And what we're actually doing that's right and what they're doing is wrong is that 40% of the beef in this country is actually produced while those cattle are in feedlots, whilst only 4% of the Brazilian beef are going through, the beef is actually being produced in feedlots. But do you know that the beef herd management program disallows the inclusion of feedlots? So this is our big advantage, and yet we're not allowed to actually bring it into our methodology. We've got to get David Littleproud to sign off on this and to make it actually part of the program, because what actually you see there is precisely what's decreasing our emissions, which is that we're feeding our cattle better food and they're actually going to market earlier. So if they're not chewing the cud as long, they're not producing so much methane. So basically, if we can actually get those cattle off the land faster and feed them better feed, we're getting less methane. But as I say, this is something we've got to resolve. Moving right along, so Richard Norton at Alice Springs in November 2017 said that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. That's nearly 2 years ago. They've already burnt about a sixth of that time, and we haven't actually got very much further. NAPCO, the 6th Australian Emissions Reduction Summit in Melbourne in May or March, released this new trademark, 5 founders, and they're going to go for carbon neutral beef, and they're going to start marketing to supermarkets carbon neutral beef. Verterra is the only company in this country that's actually demonstrated that they actually reduce their carbon footprint by employing good agricultural practice. But not only the first in Australia, I work all over the world, and let me tell you, they're also the first in the world. So it's really great to actually have that. But now we need to get the other companies involved. 6 companies have registered beef herd projects, 2 of them have been revoked. And now suddenly we're starting to see some trade branding. So we're seeing that we get grass-fed beef, and that's supposed to be better than grain-fed beef. We're getting organic beef, which you see the price is actually pretty cool, $34 a kg. But to be honest, we've got 26,300,000 cattle in this country, and they can't all go through something that's specialized like that. So why would we actually do a carbon project? And the first reason is kind of a negative. We're under huge criticism for live exports. We're under huge criticism for tree clearing and for siltation of the reef. And if we can actually demonstrate that we're actually reducing that 10% of our livestock, 5% of the emissions in Queensland cattle and 10% livestock across the country, we can actually show that we're reducing our carbon footprint. That gives us a social license to carry on with our industry. But that's kind of negative. And the real positive of doing these projects is that now we actually have a method of measuring something which is independent and anonymous if you want to. It's administered by guys in Canberra. But if you've got your club with the guys from Cape Grim and Pilbara all together in the club, you can now start actually comparing methods. And just because, the reason you're going to reduce your carbon emissions is because you're going to start employing good agricultural practices. And you can compare success across Australia. Our competitors are not, I don't know, Paraguay with NAPCO. That's not our competitors. Our competitors are the Americans, they're the Brazilians, they're the Argentinians, the Mexicans. Those are who are actually competing with us, not fellow Australians. We've got to get our whole industry together. MLA has some wonderfully good research. We need to now employ that research into our industry. Improving genetics, well, you might say it is actually possible to compare an Indicus with a Taurus from Catherine to Cape Grim. The genetics, the actual methodology of doing the genetics is there's a lot of commonality. We've got to manage our unproductive stock. We're far too sentimental in this country with our cattle. We need to get them to market faster. And there's something that Jeff and I were talking about earlier today about synchronizing herds, and based this line from Rockhampton North where they just allow the bulls to run year-round. So they're calving year-round. That's one way we can actually reduce our unproductive stock by joining those cows and bulls so they only calve over the wet season. And improving feed. And I've mentioned feedlots already, but still there's an opportunity to improve feed by improving pastures out there. So, third last slide. Carbon projects are complex and difficult for a layperson to understand and implement. Thoroughly research a project before you get into it, and seek professional help if you possibly can. I'll give you some context just now. Beef herd project methodology is a measure of good agricultural practice and could allow the Australian beef industry to compare management practices and adopt successful ideas. And also then finally promote local traditional owners and Savanna project management. And we've got some guys up in those areas who've got the smarts to actually run those projects. We could actually break this gridlock. They've got their own projects already. If we could actually get them to manage those projects, from the traditional owners to actually manage those projects, we could probably break the gridlock of the Savannah Burning. These are links, so if you actually get into a project, you're going to spend an awful lot of time speaking to the Clean Energy Regulator. Great guys to call on the phone. You're going to have to go through their website, which is linked there. Understand thoroughly the native title legal rights and eligible interest holders. And there's a link there to a 38-page document, which you need to read thoroughly. Carbon Market Institute, great organization to keep abreast of what's happening in the carbon market here and overseas. Corporate Carbon, if you actually get hold of those are the guys that do the risk mitigation. They can also tell you if your program has any chance of actually success and put you in touch with people that actually manage their program if they don't do it themselves. And finally, Endeavour, that actually shows how we are tracking. 2 degrees we're trying to reduce global warming to no more than 2 degrees. And if you click on that particular website, it'll actually tell you how Australia is doing. Guess what? Not very well. Thank you.